Welcome back. Joining me this afternoon on our panel of politicians from Melbourne, the Labor MP, Kelvin Thomson. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Ashley. Good afternoon, Fiona.
Yes, well, you beat me to it, Kelvin. We do have Fiona Nash, the National Senator, here with me in our Canberra studio. Hello to you as well.
Hi, Ashley.
Kelvin, I do want to start with you and get your reaction to Chris Bowen's announcement this morning. Are you comfortable with Labor reintroducing and putting some refugees onto temporary protection visas? It certainly looks like that's the direction Chris Bowen's heading in this morning.
Well, the Minister's intention here is clearly to encourage good conduct in detention centres and to discourage bad conduct in detention centres, and it's clear that we need to do that. The events at Villawood and other detention centres have clearly been unacceptable, and I think it is appropriate that the government takes action.
But isn't this a major backflip for Labor? We've heard people on your side for years saying that this is dangerous for people's psychological states, that it's unfair, that it doesn't work as a disincentive. Why now would Labor be saying, OK, well, if they need to be punished, well, this is the way we're going to do it?
Well, it's a response to a highly specific situation, and that is conduct in detention centres. So the government's saying we are going to encourage good conduct and we're going to discourage bad conduct in detention centres through the use of the temporary visa. And I think that's appropriate. I think if you're going to say, as the Liberals do, everyone should have temporary protection visas, then it's got no deterrent value. And if you're going to say, as the Greens do, there should be no temporary protection visas, then that won't have any impact either. So we do need to say the conduct in the detention centres is unacceptable and take action to prevent it.
But one of the arguments against TPVs is that people who don't have access to that family reunion, well, it then means that women and children are more likely to risk their lives and follow their family member out to Australia on a boat as a result of that. Doesn't that argument still stand, even, regardless of the reason they've been put on the TPV, the impact is still going to be the same, isn't it?
Doesn't it suggest, Ashley, that people might think first before they engage in violence against property or violence against persons at the detention centre if they're aware that they may be given a temporary protection visa and therefore not have those rights, that's something that they will think about and should think about before they behave badly at a detention centre?
Well, let's get Fiona Nash's view. Do you think the changes put forward by the Minister today make sense?
Well, we'll certainly look at the legislation when we see it, but it really is just more policy on the run from the government. What we've seen today really is a band-aid solution of treating the symptom, not the cause, if you like. The government needs to go right back to the beginning of all of this and look at the policies that are going to work to stop the boats coming. I think with this particular issue, people are sick to death of waking up hearing about rioting in detention centres. Now we've got this idea from the Minister on the run about how to use a TPV to address this particular issue, but the government has to get back to the basics and solve the problem. And it's this lack of resolve from the government that we've seen all the way along that really is the issue. So we're not very clear as yet exactly how this legislation will look. We'll have a look at it, but it is simply yet another on-the-run bit of policy from the government.
I would have thought that the Coalition would be far more welcoming of the general proposition, considering that your side of politics has been calling for a much tougher approach for so long.
Well, we'll certainly have a look at it when it turns up, when we finally see what the detail is going to be. And you're right, we have been calling for stronger resolve from this Labor government for a very long time. We have been saying the TPVs should apply across the board. The government, Prime Minister, should go to Nauru. They should start making some decisions about how to deal with this properly instead of just this on-the-run band-aid solution type of approach we're seeing all the time.
Of course, Chris Bowen says this is very different to the blanket TPV approach that the Coalition has been advocating. Labor keeps telling us about all the problems associated with TPVs, things like the psychological impact on people who are put on them, saying they're unfair, that they're inefficient, that most people who are put on TPVs ended up staying in Australia anyway. Those are all valid arguments.
I think what we need to do is look at the argument then when the Coalition left government, there were 4 people in detention. We now have something like 7 7,000. So the policies that are in place that are causing this, the policies in this place that are putting these pull factors into place have to be changed, and the government's got to take the responsibility. They face a real dilemma. They're really jammed here with the Greens and their view on asylum seekers, because we have this Labor-Greens independent cobbled together government, and the Greens gave them that government. We have a situation now where we've got 6 members of Parliament out of a Parliament of 226, the Greens telling the government what to do.
Well, the Greens are furious about this. So obviously today the Greens aren't telling the government what to do. You would have heard my interview with Sarah Hanson-Young a bit earlier. Kelvin, do you think that some of your colleagues on the left of the Labor Party would also share those views that this is an inappropriate step for a Labor government to be taking?
Well, I haven't heard from colleagues, so they can speak for themselves in relation to these matters, but I think it's very clear that the Minister is seeking to genuinely deal with a real problem, which is misconduct in detention centres, and everybody, including the Greens, say that that conduct is unacceptable and should not be condoned. This is a serious endeavour to deal with it by putting in place a mechanism which will encourage good conduct and discourage bad conduct at detention centres.
Still, though, what's next? I mean, we're seeing that the process of setting up a regional processing centre in East Timor is certainly stalled. A lot of people think that'll never get off the ground. Is Labor next going to be looking at Nauru as another option that the coalition has been putting forward?
Well, I think, Ashley, that everyone's frustrated about the number of people who are arriving in Australia. There's no doubt that that's a source of frustration for all of us. But the truth is that Australia isn't Robinson Crusoe in this regard. You see people arriving in the island of Lampedusa off the coast of Italy, or through Mexico into the United States and countries in Europe. That problem of asylum seekers is a global problem. It's very easy to produce the glib slogan, "Stop the boats." The truth is, if there was a coalition government, we'd be experiencing identical problems.
I do want to move on. We are running out of time. Fiona Nash, Julia Gillard, of course, is in China. Just how big a test do you think this visit is for her, and how do you rate her handling of this trip to North Asia so far?
It will be a big test of how she actually performs on the world stage. We heard her say some time ago now that I think international affairs wasn't really her bag. But it will be a big test for her how she handles this, how she manages the situation in China, how she raises the issue of the human rights issue in China.
Do you think that human rights in China is still a major issue? We've seen, of course, senior Chinese diplomats saying today that a lot of progress has been made, and there are calls for Julia Gillard to acknowledge that progress while she is in China. But over the weekend we saw 36 Christians arrested over the Easter break. Hundreds have been detained in their homes. Does that sound like progress to you?
Well, not being there, I can't possibly judge, but I think it's really important that it is appropriate for Australia to raise concerns where we have them around the human rights issue in China. It's in no way telling the Chinese government what to do, but it is entirely appropriate that we do raise those concerns. I think, as importantly, the Prime Minister has to raise with China while she's there, are they going to have a carbon tax? Because she's going to put one on the Australian people that's going to make no difference to the climate, while the major emitters are not doing anything substantive towards that. It's a question she certainly has to ask.
Kelvin, we saw also a nationalistic newspaper in China today wrote an editorial calling for Julia Gillard to show basic respect to China while she is in the country. Is that a dig at Kevin Rudd, that perhaps he didn't show or wasn't seen to show that basic respect when he was last in China as Prime Minister, when he made that very public speech about the human rights issue at a Chinese university?
I'm not sure who it's aimed at, Ashley, but the truth is we need to be able to say to China exactly what we think, just as we need to be able to say this to the United States and to Russia and to India, etc. One of the greatest temptations in political life is to turn a blind eye to the excesses of your friends and supporters. It's a great temptation, but it's also a great failing, and we need to resist that. We need to be able to say honestly to China that we are concerned about human rights issues, and that we believe that China needs to allow for freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and to move in a more democratic direction.
Just very quickly before we go, today Tony Abbott is on Christmas Island with his Shadow Immigration Minister Scott Morrison. They've been getting briefings from the Immigration Department, and also Tony Abbott this morning was out doing some exercise drills with AFP officers. We've got the vision of him doing that here. We've seen Lindsay Tanner's written a new book. It's being released this week. Fiona Nash, in this book, Lindsay Tanner says that a lot of politics is stunt-driven, it's media-driven. They have to do silly stunts like this for the cameras all the time. Do you worry about that? Do you think that Lindsay Tanner has a point and this 24-hour news cycle is a real worry in this political age?
I don't particularly worry about it. I think you can see examples from the current Labor government where they are constantly driven by the news cycle and by the spin. I don't think it's necessarily across the board. These things sometimes get a run, sometimes they don't. It's more important, though, certainly from our position as the coalition, that the policies out there that we would have in government are conveyed very clearly to the people.
Kelvin, are you worried there's too much spin going on in modern politics?
I fear for this when, during the course of the last election campaign, I saw the Deputy Leader of the Opposition engage in a staring contest with a gnome. But your program, Ashley, is an honourable exception.
Oh, well, that's a very fine way to end the program. Kelvin Thomson and Fiona Nash, thank you both for joining us this afternoon. This afternoon, David Spears will be back with PM Agenda at 4:15. His guest